A good many of the subjects we choose arise from letters or from persons who come in with special problems or ask about various attitudes. And this morning's belongs to that type of subject matter. Not only does it represent a very common request for direction, but it is also something bearing upon our observation of the situations that arise in the lives of our friends. One of our problems today is this peculiar lack of maturity which seems to trouble so many American people. We have so many advantages, so many opportunities, such wonderful privileges, and our physical and mechanical culture has developed so rapidly that a great many persons are not aware that the individual as a person may not have developed as well and as naturally and reasonably as might be desired. We have put so much weight upon things around us, upon common motions, and have depended so heavily for security upon the institutions we have created that we have sort of forgotten to grow ourselves. And due to this oversight, we are not in a condition to meet certain emergencies that must inevitably arise in a complex culture such as our own. We did not notice this condition so much even through World War II. But in this post-war adjustment situation, we are becoming more and more aware of the need for values within ourselves which we have not properly cultivated. And so this morning we want to probe into this a little, trying to discover, if possible, how we can strengthen, develop, and enrich phases of our own natures. What is serene living? Is it possible? Is it possible for the individual to live well without deluding himself, without merely denying the challenge of his time? Is it possible for him to be happy in a world of persons who are not happy? Has he any right to be happy apart from the common contentment of his fellow man? Are we justified in searching for or requiring comfort and security in a world in which these values appear to be lacking? What is insecurity as we consider it today? Is insecurity actually a condition that arises from some common force which, working around us and among us, forces us to center our own attention upon it? Is this insecurity a kind of enemy against which we must all turn to protect ourselves, something we must defeat as we would an adversary at war? Is this insecurity something different from ourselves? The answer seems to be that it is not. This insecurity is not a common enemy, it is ourselves. It is not something which we can turn and attack, because it exists within our own natures. This insecurity, therefore, is not something for which we have to have a common sense of conscience. It is something which each individual can only correct by correcting it in himself. He is not a traitor to anyone else, because it is simply impossible for us to bestow security upon any other living creature. Security is something that belongs peculiarly to the integration of the individual. What we term common security is simply collective individual security. What we call world peace is nothing but individual peace infinitely multiplied. Therefore, we cannot dedicate ourselves to world peace without recognizing that it is unattainable unless individuals achieve a peaceful attitude. Thus, what we call security or serenity of living today cannot result from the conversion or culturing of other persons directly. We can contribute opportunity to help other persons to grow, but we cannot make them grow. We cannot demand growth, nor can we justly condemn those who do not grow. Our problem remains essentially with ourselves, that we live in a certain kind of a world. The only way we can live in it well is by understanding it as thoroughly as we can. Out of understanding comes acceptances. Acceptances that are reasonable, understandable, practical. These acceptances are the basis of our own personal conduct. What we understand and accept will not disturb us unreasonably. As long, however, as we demand from others or from situations those values which are not reasonable in others or in other situations, we shall be in trouble. We are not in trouble because of the insecurity of our world. We are in trouble because of the individual insecurity of our fellow men. And others in their problems include us among the causes of their anxiety. As long as we are unpredictable, someone else is insecure because of us. We are so much concerned with the insecurities that others cause that we may totally overlook the insecurity that we cause. An individual, for example, with an uncertain temperament, a temper that may flash up at any moment, may feel that he has perfect right to this kind of a disposition. He knows why he is going to get mad. He knows approximately when he is going to get mad, or the type of conditions that will provoke him. But this individual, with his inconsistent attitudes, is a cause of insecurity to those around him, regardless of the ways in which he justifies his own attitudes. The worrier, the jealous person, the gossip, these individuals are causes of insecurity to others. So each individual who is not secure in himself, has not certain integrities strongly developed in his own nature, is a cause of fear, a cause of worry, and of anxiety and uncertainty to persons around him. Thus, this problem of insecurity has a sort of chain reaction, and it communicates itself from one person to another, and in grave critical periods where the phenomenal situations are intense, the insecurity pressures reach climatic importance. They become critical in our national or individual affairs. Insecurity is largely the individual's reasonable doubts or unreasonable doubts about providence, about the kind of world in which he lives, and about the people around him. This kind of insecurity is bound to result in conclusions and attitudes. Serenity is a matter of attitude. The individual with the right attitude can maintain a reasonable degree of serenity. One of the things he has to get rid of, however, in order to have this proper collective attitude, is suspicion. Another thing, criticism. The critical person can never be serene, because he can never be without causes which justify anxiety. The suspicious person can never be serene, because he is always in the presence of circumstances which excite his suspicion and cause him to doubt providence, or to doubt the particular actions of those around him. A person who is bound to historical perspective can seldom attain a serene attitude. The chaos of Europe is due to historical perspective. Europe is so afraid of the future and so dominated by pressures of the past that it has no opportunity to live now. It is living always in the shadow of something. The majority of human beings who are living in their own private worlds live in shadows also. They live in shadows consisting of the past, moving in upon them. They cannot escape the consequences of past causations. They are unable to free themselves from old antagonisms, old opinions, old prejudices, old intolerances. These things move in upon now, clouding it and overshadowing it. Also, these same persons cannot live clearly in the face of the future. To them, the future is always doubtful. It is either an abstract hope or an abstract fear. We are always afraid of the unknown, and we may also build a future upon hopes that are not reasonable or practical, and therefore face futures of disappointments and reverses. But all these situations arise within our own consciousness, and the world around us, before it can reach us, must pass through the censorship of our own mental and emotional natures. And here is where the trouble begins. The trouble begins where man begins to interpret, in terms of his own nature, things that have an existence apart from himself. He takes the world condition and interprets it in terms of his own ignorance. He uses whatever attitudes and prejudices he is familiar with. And by the time he gets through interpreting events, he can frighten himself to death with them. Another person with a different attitude, interpreting the same events, comes up with an entirely different conclusion. Thus, one of the difficulties in our peace of mind is that the sensory messages which reach us from the outer world cannot and are not honestly received. They cannot be merely registered and factually examined. They must pass through the involved and complicated psychic organism which we have built. The individual is not neutral in anything. He is not able merely to accept a fact, register that fact, and live according to it. The moment he gets into the presence of a fact, he begins to interpret the fact out of the fact. He begins to impose upon this fact all forms of modifying opinions of his own. He cannot merely accept an event. He cannot say, this is what has happened. This is the way I will react to it. Long before he can come to these rather simple conclusions, he has distorted the event out of all proportion. He has tried to fit it into patterns of his own experience which may be inadequate, probably are. And he is taking it always for granted that the future must be identical with the past, and whatever has been a general acceptance must continue to be. Thus he locks himself, and what could be an experience becomes a problem. What could be a challenge becomes a catastrophe. To meet this kind of a situation means more or less a re-evaluation of our approach to a great many of our essential responsibilities. And I like sometimes to think of the way in which the old Zen masters of Japan attempted to explain and interpret many of these interesting problems. The first problem that the individual has to decide, according to the old Zen concept, is whether or not the individual is going to be alive or whether the problems are going to be alive. Where is the center of consciousness going to be? Is it going to be in the center of us, or is it going to be drowned in the difficulties? If it is in the center of us, we can control any difficulty. If we lose this center, we are gradually going to tangle ourselves into a confusion for which perhaps we can find no solution. In the terms of time, the center for ourselves is now. Now is the only moment which is essentially and inevitably real. It is also the only moment that is under our control. It is under our control for the instant of its own existence. And what we call time is an endless progression of instants. Now. It is now continuing. And adjustment is the individual's sense of consciousness forever functioning in the immediate now. 5 minutes ago was now. 5 minutes passed. It is no longer now. Now has moved, like consciousness, from one time pattern to another. And by virtue of this motion, time now has left things behind. Even while we are speaking, an instant has gone into eternity. If at any point in the individual's existence he ties himself to this time, to this instant, then he is lost, because he goes into eternity with it. But if he can move from one instant to another, retaining always the immediate fact of now, he is in a peculiarly rich situation. You remember in the pact in Faust, where Faust and Mephisto discuss how the famous pact is going to be paid off in the end. And Faust makes a kind of an agreement, an arrangement that he considers suitable to his own need. And he says, if ever to the passing hour I say, O stay, thou art so fair, then unto thee I give the power to drag me down to hell's despair. Then may my fate no longer linger. Then from my service thou art free. Fall from the clock the index finger. Be time all over then for me. In other words, the moment the individual attaches himself to a unit of time, he passes into limbo with it. Thus, in Zen, the great problem is to preserve eternal immediacy. The kind of now which is forever freedom. For now you can do anything you want. But the moment now becomes past, you can only do whatever you can do. Once a thing is done, it may never be possible to undo it. Nor do we gain any wealth of understanding by vague hoping that the future is the time for doing. The individual who ties himself to the past is lost. The individual who awaits forever the future, like old Wilkins Macabre in Dickens, waiting for something to turn up, is also lost. The actual immediacy is now. The use of now determines all things. The only value that the past has is that it equips us to use the now. The only value the future has is that it is the extension of the now and presents now to us as infinite opportunity, a foreverness of now. In this now, therefore, the Zen master says, we have freedom. We have no freedom except the freedom of this decision, this conclusion, this attitude, spontaneously taken at this moment. Now we can dedicate ourselves to various purposes that we regard as important. Now we can accept the burden of our life with complete personal privilege of decision. Now we can face facts without burdening them with our own old fears or morbid anticipations. Now, therefore, is a strangely strong point of decision. It is a clean-cut instant. But man, unless he understands it, refuses to accept it as such. He shifts immediately to the future or to the past, simply to evade the responsibility of decision. So lack of serenity arises, in part at least, from man's continuous effort to evade the need for immediate decision. The individual who is afraid to face a fact sets in motion patterns of evasion which must inevitably add to confusion. He therefore loses the power of immediate adjustment, and he may well confuse the lives of others around him by this strange inability to decide or to determine the course of action. Another important fragment of Zen philosophy is the symbolism of the tangled cord. The average person is tied up like the famous Gordian knot, which Alexander the Great finally faced with the curious decision that perhaps is almost oriental. Alexander examined this knot that no man could untie. He obviously worked with it for a while, became impatient of it, and then suddenly with his sword he cut the knot, and that was the end of it. So he achieved this strange freedom from involvement. And in the Bhagavad Gita, the great Indian classic, we have this sword of quick detachment with which the wise man cuts down the tree with its serpent-like branches and roots that attempt to hold or bind the consciousness of the individual. This problem, then, of getting rid of the knots along this cord of life, we may say that the cord of life is man's internal structure. And if we toss it down upon the ground, it seems to represent a road leading forward through time, through man's span of existence. For the nature of the road he travels is determined by the amount of confusion or complexity there is within himself. There is an old Indian fable of the wonder worker tossing the cord into the air. It forms a ladder, and he climbs up the ladder and disappears in space. In the Zen philosophy, each individual is in a state of tension, or he is knotted by the confusion which ties up the sympathetic or autonomic nervous system. Every stress, every strain that we have ties up the ganglia and plexi of our nervous system. These become, so to say, so tense, so wound up and tied up, that the individual finds it less and less possible to relax. Another difficulty with us all dispositionally is that no one can be serene and tense at the same time. We cannot be under pressure and stress and at the same time move smoothly along our road of life. Thus the Zen points out the tremendous importance of reducing these stress areas to stop being tense. Now, why are we tense? Now, every individual has a different answer for why he is tense. But the most common one that I've heard, and perhaps one of the most eloquent, is simply that things are not going the way we want them to. This is almost certain to do it. We have something all planned and the bottom falls out of it. Being unable to relinquish or let go, we fall into a state of wishful thinking. We regret what did not work out, and we stand in constant anxiety about what we do not want that might take the place of the thing that did not work out. So while one of our reasons for tension is the fact that things are not going our way, the question may also then arise in the thoughtful, how shall we estimate the true value of things that do not go our way? Perhaps we have forgotten that it is not the duty of nature to go our way, that the duty of those around us is not to always do what we want to do. The question that we must finally decide is, what is nature's way, and are we going that way? Usually Zen, then, will come out with this simple statement that anxiety is the result of the individual placing his own purposes first and the laws of the universe later, if at all. The person who is living within a lawful universe does not have nearly as many anxieties as the individual who is trying to be a law unto himself, a very difficult task, one which causes only strain in the majority of cases. So we have this problem also in our Zen thinking, namely that knotting or tying up in tension patterns is the result of the individual not getting what he wants or getting what he does not want. It's the result of his own plan being interfered with by situations or conditions imposing themselves upon him. If these conditions are in the forms of persons, we will resent those persons. We consider that anything that interferes with our plan is bad. That our plan itself might not be good seldom concerns us. But we may find out, as we study a little, that those plans most fragile and most likely to be interfered with are the plans which are themselves least real, least valuable, and least honorable. Actually, the more selfish our plan, the less likely it is to succeed. And also, if it be essentially selfish, the less likely it is to bring any serenity of life, even if it does succeed. We observe, therefore, many persons who attain their plans which they knew would make them happy, but these persons are not happy. The plan did not, by its fulfillment, produce any more security than would have followed had it not succeeded. Serenity, therefore, does not lie in increasing the satisfaction of our own inclinations. It arises from the reduction of the pressure of our own unreasonable attitudes. And here we have to begin the process of education, self-culturing. Nearly all persons are operating from a philosophy of life that is essentially inadequate. This means that whether this philosophy be established on a religious level or on an intellectual level, it is not strong enough to actually control and direct conduct. It may be strong enough to be considered a very wonderful overtone in our living. We may admire it, we may declare ourselves dedicated to it, but in emergency it does not stand there and support us. It means that there is a conflict in which our real beliefs are not as strong as our desires, our inclinations, our attitudes, and our determinations at any particular moment. Because of this lack of interior maturity, we cannot control the tendency to be confused that arises in the personality. So let us pause for a moment in the terms of some of the old Oriental fabulists and try to understand a little bit more about this personality of ours. There's an old Indian fable that man, having evolved upward through all the kingdoms of nature, has all of the other kingdoms inside of him. Therefore, the man, whether he realizes it or not, has within him not only his human life, but perhaps he has a group of animal lives, even plant and vegetable lives. There is within man a certain instinct to vegetate. We've all met persons who are outstanding examples of vegetables. They have never moved away from some truly vegetative existence. They have never accepted any more personal responsibility than an onion, and they never will. There are other human beings in whom various animal natures are quite obvious. We find the individual who has the temperament of the fox, another with the courage of a lion, a third with the erudition and general temperament of an elephant. Then we have the perpetual anthropoid. We have the monkey. We have the serpent. We have all kinds of different animals within our own natures, according to the fable. Now, these animals are not bad because they're in there. We have them because we have all of these dispositions within ourselves. There are moments when quiet persons roar like a lion. There are other moments when we follow instinctively the impulses of various creatures within ourselves. So let us look at our lives for a moment. We are moving along with some degree of placidity, and then someone says something we do not like. Immediately one of these animals comes out. We start to snarl or bark. And after the mood has passed, this animal disappears again. Where is it when it isn't in use? Where is jealousy while we do not feel it? We get along very nicely. All of a sudden, some one thing that happens makes us desperately jealous. And we have a terrible struggle to try to finally overcome it and get ourselves back in shape again. We consider it a real victory when we achieve this. Now, when we have finally beaten this jealousy, and until it has disappeared, may not show up again for several years, where is it? Has it died? Has anything died that can be invoked at any moment by the pressure of circumstances? Hate can come out of an individual who apparently is a most kindly and loving person. Why? Where is the hate when he is not hating? Where is anger or jealousy when we feel friendship? Where is hatred when we are in love? Where is love when we hate? We are therefore a complex creature with many potentials and powers within ourselves. And at one time or another, any one of these may come out and take control, controlling us for a time and then disappearing again. not to be heard from for some time. So all these things are within us as matters to be examined and to be carried in our minds and thoughts. Thus we may have within ourselves a number of persons, more persons than the famous faces of Eve in the recent psychological report. In these different persons, we have different levels of decision. And these different levels of decision at various times come out to complicate life for us. We are going along and someone does us an injury, real or imaginary. Instantly we decide the only thing to do is hit back. They made us suffer. Let's make them suffer a little more right now. So we do it. A few days later we wonder why we did it and proceed to try to put together the trouble that this particular flash of intolerance caused. And perhaps it may take a lifetime to repair the damage. And we go through the years deprived of something valuable or in the presence of a difficult situation simply because we had no self-control. Then we have another level in ourselves that the moment a problem arises, we settle down to chronic worrying. We can't help it. We just have to worry when we feel like worrying. So we worry. And if life becomes too monotonous or situations become too consistently difficult, worry becomes a habit, and we finally discover that we cannot even break the habit. It is worse than narcotics or alcohol. So we simply worry ourselves slowly into a state of eternal acidity. We pay with our lives for worry. Then we may find another attitude. We may find a curious kind of impractical and unreasonable optimism. We will accept only something that cannot happen. So we wait and we hope and we believe and we're discouraged and perhaps finally embittered. Not because of the facts, but because we demanded something that wasn't reasonable. So by degrees, we tie ourselves into these tension patterns. One of the reasons, of course, obviously, is that these different levels of our personality have their own little political entities, and if we are not running our lives, one of these lesser levels will run our living for us. Now, these lesser levels together make up our personality. But any one of them, detached from the others, is less than we are. Consequently, the moment we lose total control, any part that takes over is less than our own complete nature. It must be deficient in something. The part cannot be equal to the whole. And whatever phase of our nature takes over when the total person relinquishes leadership, that part is unsatisfactory and is likely to get us into further trouble. So our problem always is to maintain the leadership of consciousness over the aspects of our own personalities. Unless we do so, we are bound to fall into troubles and pressures and tensions and stress patterns. To maintain this leadership means that we must understand as much as we can about our natures and about our thinking and our living. Thus we say that in most cases it is inadequacy of understanding that is our trouble, and we need a kind of education. It is not the kind of education that deals merely with objective forms of learning. It is a kind of education that has to do with qualities of living. The end of it being that man shall become reasonable. And that phase of that knowledge, which is dealing with the problem of the reasonable, we generally term philosophy. But we can extend it to include religion, mysticism, metaphysics, whatever our interests may be. But essentially, the purpose of wisdom is that the person shall be reasonable. and being reasonable, shall be in control of himself at all times, so that there is no possibility of an action that is contrary to reason. Now, this might sound as though we were making life a little dull and colorless, but such is not the case. The reasonable is always more magnificent, more dynamic than the error. The reasonable, because it is harmonious, is also beautiful. And because it is beautiful, it is good. And because it is good and beautiful, it is the absolute necessity of our living. Thus, by gradually cultivating certain essential reasonableness, we begin to experience the possibility of serenity. For serenity is, of course, the individual united within himself. It is the parts of the person serving the total being, each one contributing toward unity, rather than attempting an individual escape into isolated dictatorial conduct. Thus, if all the parts of man work together, the good of man is assured, just as it is true that if all the parts of society work together, the good of society is secured. But if the parts of society are in conflict one with another, then society is insecure. And if man suddenly finds himself in servitude to his ambition, or in servitude to his opinions, or in servitude to his avarice, he is no longer secure. He finds that he has sacrificed security to the gratification of an unreasonable desire. And most persons who lose security lose it because of unreasonable desire, which, not being fulfilled, or if fulfilled, producing no comfort in itself, adds nothing to the permanent good of the individual. We go back then to our concept of Zen. How can we achieve a serenity of consciousness without negation? We talk to people about these problems, and they say, well, we are supposed to overlook a lot, aren't we? No, we're not. We're not supposed to overlook anything. We're supposed to understand through things. To close our minds to a value or to a problem is not to solve it. Solution lies always in one thing: total understanding. The individual who simply closes his eyes to trouble and says it isn't there is not solving anything. But the individual who thoroughly understands the situation discovers that it is not trouble. It is something else, which previously he did not know. The end, therefore, of the search for serenity is not denial of fact, but rather the recognition of fact and the recovery from error. For it is the assumption of the fact of something that is not true that lies underneath nearly all the tension that the human being develops. He has placed his own decision of what is so above the decision of the universe. He has attempted to trust himself totally to his own imperfect knowledge, and as a result, he is not able to conduct his life adequately. How then can he achieve this condition of greater total understanding of value? The Zen monk would say one of the things that is important is the ability to respond or react normally to challenge. If the individual follows his own most basic consciousness, he will generally do the thing which is next for him. He will either learn the lesson, or he will create a situation from which he will learn indirectly the solution to his problem. In order to function by this method, however, he must realize that immediate contentment is not the end which nature intends. The end which nature intends is ultimate victory of reality in his life. Therefore, all decisions which have delusion in them will cause further stress and strain until the individual stops that kind of decision.